Imagine a morgue, but not for people, for massive, twisted steel beasts. It was here, amidst the smell of burning and decay, that a true monster was born in a single short night. This is not a story of parade ground heroism. This is the story of how two dead machines were welded into one Frankenstein that was expected to survive exactly 10 minutes. You will learn the price of physics when 48 kilograms of explosives meet German armor at point-blank range. What to do when a jammed gun breech has to be hammered shut right in the middle of a battle, staring down the barrel of an enemy Tiger. And the most terrifying moment. What happens inside a steel box when the shells run out and the enemy is 10 meters away? Stay until the end to see how raw engineering fury and 46 tons of weight can become the last and most terrible weapon when there is nothing left to shoot. Black, greasy smoke hung over the ravine, thick as the wool of a greatcoat. The smell of burnt rubber overpowered even the sickly sweet stench of decomposition that always accompanies collection points for wrecked vehicles. Here, on the backwaters of the Belarusian front, the war did not thunder with orchestras. It wheezed through the punctured lungs of engines and ground its teeth with twisted metal. It was a morgue for machinery. June 1944. Senior Lieutenant Gromov wiped his face with an oily rag, leaving black streaks on his skin. His eyes watered from the acrid smoke, but his hands, accustomed to the cold of steel, remained steady. Before him lay a map, a crumpled sheet of paper with pencil marks that meant death. The Germans were breaking out of the cauldron. An elite tank group, cornered, was preparing for a final lunge. They had no choice but to break through, and they had Tigers and Panthers. Gromov had nothing but an order to plug the gap. The count was not in days, but in hours. Headquarters demanded heavy equipment, capable of stopping the Wehrmacht's steel battering ram, but there were no operational machines. All combat-ready armor was already burning on the front lines, or had gone deep into the breakthrough. Here, in the repair battalion, only the dead remained. Gromov walked along the row of shattered hulls, his boots squelching in mud mixed with used oil. He looked at the machinery, not as a commander, but as a pathologist. He needed a donor. To his right, the skeleton of an ISU-152 self-propelled gun was burning out. A direct hit by a shaped charged shell into the side had turned the fighting compartment into a furnace. The metal still held the heat of the fire. Gromov knew the temperature inside had risen to 800 degrees. The gun breech was warped, the panoramic sight had melted and flowed down like a cloudy drop. This machine was dead for good. But the chassis had survived. The road wheels, torsion bars, even the idler wheel. Everything was in place, covered in soot, but intact. To his left stood another self-propelled gun. It had lost a track and tipped onto its side like a wounded beast. The casemate was slashed by shrapnel, the gun mantlet pitted, but the barrel, a long, predatory pipe of 152mm caliber, looked at the sky without visible damage. It was the ML-20S howitzer cannon, 7 meters and 17 centimeters of alloy steel, a weapon capable of sending 48 kilograms of explosives to the horizon. Gromov stepped closer, running his palm over the cold metal of the barrel. Rough surface, scratches, but the geometry was unbroken. "Comrade Senior Lieutenant, it's scrap metal." The voice of the maintenance chief, a captain with a face gray from fatigue, sounded dull, as if from underwater. "The wiring is successfully burned out on the first one, and the gun mount is warped. The second has a shattered transmission and a crack in the crankcase. We need to write them off." Gromov didn't turn around. He looked at the massive muzzle brake, in the slots of which a dry branch was stuck. "We'll write them off after the war." He cut him off. "The Germans will reach the crossroads in 8 hours. We don't have 8 hours to request reserves. We have 2 halves from which we need to assemble 1 whole." The maintenance chief spat into the mud. "You're asking for the impossible, Gromov. To move a gun from one casemate to another, you need a crane and a factory brigade. The weight of the system with the cradle is over 3 tons. We only have a winch on a light truck and 5 shell-shocked mechanics. And a night. 1 short summer night." Gromov turned to him. The senior lieutenant's gaze was heavy, like the caliber of his machines. He didn't see problems. He saw a task. A technical solution to an emergency situation. "The first machine," he began to list, bending fingers covered in a crust of scuffed skin, "has a live V2IS engine, 12 cylinders, 520 horsepower. The transmission is intact. The second has a live gun and ammo rack. We cut the roof off the first casemate, dismantle the damaged artillery mount, take the gun from the second, and marry them." "The weld won't hold," the maintenance chief objected, but the doubt of a professional calculating options had already appeared in his voice. "When firing, the recoil is dozens of tons. It'll tear it to hell along with the mantlet." "We'll weld it to death." Gromov stepped toward the skeleton. "Reinforce it with gussets. We'll take armor plates from the sides of German trophies. The steel there is cemented. We don't need beauty. We need this beast to fire at least 10 shots and not fall apart." Silence stood around them, broken only by the distant rumble of the front. This rumble was like the growling of a huge beast that is sleeping for now, but will soon wake up and demand blood. Gromov knew the physics of this sound. It was thousands of engines working, thousands of tracks clanking. Tens of thousands of tons of steel were moving east. And there was nothing to stop them here, in this sector. Except for engineering fury and 46 tons of iron that were still just a pile of junk. The maintenance chief walked up to the machine and kicked a road wheel with his boot. The sound was dull, solid. 6 hours, he said. If we don't finish by dawn, German tanks will shoot us right here, up on the jacks. We'll finish. Gromov was already climbing onto the armor, checking the hatch latches. Call the men. Bring the acetylene, electrodes, sledgehammers. Everything we have. And find me a bucket of heavy grease. The situation was extremely simple in its monstrosity. A technical catastrophe superimposed on tactical hopelessness. 2 heavy self-propelled artillery mounts, ISU 152, each of which was the pinnacle of Soviet tank building, now represented useless monuments to war. But Gromov saw potential in them. He knew every screw in this system. He remembered by heart the valve clearances and the torque for the cylinder head bolts. An algorithm was already building in his head. Step 1, gas cutting. Step 2, rigging. Step 3, welding. It wasn't magic, not a miracle. It was strength of materials and mechanics. Heavy, dirty work with iron that weighed more than common sense. He jumped down from the armor, feeling the pain reverberate in an old wound. But right now, that didn't matter. Only kilograms, newtons, and millimeters mattered. The war for him had now shrunk to the size of a repair pad. "Crew to me!" Gromov barked, and his voice drowned out the noise of the wind. "We work until our hands bleed. Anyone who dies, I'll bury personally, but after the battle." "Is the task clear?" From the darkness, by the fire where the mechanics were warming themselves, 4 figures rose. Men in oily overalls, with faces looking like baked potatoes. They didn't ask questions. They knew. If Gromov said to weld armor, that meant they would weld armor, even if they had to melt steel with their own breath. The night began that was to give birth to a monster, a hybrid of two dead machines created for only one purpose: to kill tigers. Gromov took the cutting torch in his hands, checked the tank valve. The hiss of gas sounded like a snake's whisper. He struck the flint, and a blue flame roared out, illuminating his face, hard, focused, devoid of fear, but full of cold calculation. Ahead lay 6 hours of hellish labor to create an argument of 152mm caliber. A blinding white flash of the electric arc tore the darkness, burning purple spots onto retinas. The night ceased to be a time of day. It turned into a space of struggle between metal and will. Here, on a patch of oily earth, the laws of physics entered into conflict with the necessity to survive. Gromov didn't feel fatigue. Adrenaline worked like a high-pressure fuel pump, injecting energy in direct doses into his blood. He held the welding stinger like a violinist holds a bow, only instead of music, the crackle of 400-amp discharges was born. The senior lieutenant welded it himself. He didn't trust anyone else. The seam at the junction of the frontal armor and the casemate had to withstand monstrous vibrations. If the weld turned out porous, at the first hit, or even its own shot, the casemate would fold inward, crushing the crew. Gromov guided the electrode smoothly, forming scales of molten metal. Memories of Tula workshops floated up, the smell of scale and the stern voice of the shiftmaster. "Armor doesn't forgive mistakes, son."
A lack of fusion is a hole in your head.
Now these words sounded not like instruction, but like a technical condition of operation. Around him, men moved in the rhythm of a grim ballet. No unnecessary words, only hoarse breathing and the clank of tools. The crew had turned into a single mechanism, where every person was a functional unit. The loader, a big man with singed eyebrows, leveraged heavy jacks, lifting the torn engine deck plate. The gunner, squinting from the smoke, handed over wrenches. The sizes of the nuts here were such that a wrench weighed as much as a good rifle. "Heave!" The short shout of the maintenance chief covered the hum of the transformer. "Heave a little," responded the driver mechanic. They were installing the gun. 152mm, System ML-20S. The barrel with the breech weighed more than 2,500 kilograms.
The winch on the captured truck howled from the strain. The cable rang, ready to snap and cut people in half.
Gromov lifted the mantlet shield. He watched the massive steel pipe, slowly, millimeter by millimeter, crawl into the casemate embrasure. It was open-heart surgery on a monster. One wrong move, and the heavy breech block would crash down, breaking the transmission and the repairmen's bones. "Stop!" Gromov yelled, noticing a misalignment. He leaped to the gun, grabbing a sledgehammer. The jeweled precision of tweezers didn't work here. Kinetic energy of impact worked here. "Left! More!" Bang! Another blow. Sparks from the steel. The massive trunnions ground into their grooves with a screech. "Lower away! Secure it!" The fighters' hands were black from fuel oil and graphite grease. The skin on their knuckles burst, but no one paid attention to the blood. Pain was a signal the brain ignored as unnecessary. Inside the casemate, the heat was like a blast furnace.
The red-hot metal after welding took a long time to cool, heating the air to a state where every breath burned the lungs. Sweat flooded eyes, stinging them with salt. But there was nothing to wipe faces with. The rags had long ago turned into oily lumps. They were assembling this Frankenstein from pieces. The chassis from the machine with number 312. The gun from 405. Armor plates to reinforce the holes were cut from a knocked-out German transporter. German metal, alloyed with nickel, welded poorly with high-hardness Soviet armor. But Gromov knew the secret: reverse polarity and a short arc. "Holding?" asked the gunner, nodding at the patch on the left side. "You couldn't tear it off with your teeth," Gromov grunted, changing the electrode. The Germans supplied the armor themselves. Symbolic. By 3 in the morning, fatigue fell like a concrete slab. Movements slowed. Men began to stumble on level ground. Gromov understood. This was the critical moment. The physiological limit. The body's resources were exhausted. But 2 hours remained until dawn, and the machine was still a pile of iron. "Smoke break. 5 minutes," he commanded. "Drink some water." They fell right onto the ground, leaning their backs against the tracks. Silence covered the repair zone for a moment. In this silence, one could distinctly hear the metal cooling, crackling like bones. "Comrade Commander," the loader asked quietly, "what about shells?" "We have shells. Found 20 armor-piercing rounds in the cellar. Full load of high explosives. Enough to plow a field." Gromov spoke dryly, without emotion. His task was to instill confidence in the instrument. At 0400 hours came the moment of truth. Assembly complete. The machine stood looking like a scarred veteran. Fresh welding seams snaked across the casemate in rough ridges. Multicolored paint, somewhere faded green, somewhere German gray covered in soot, created a gruesome camouflage. Team Tula. That's what Gromov nicknamed it to himself. "Driver, prepare to start." The command sounded like a sentence. The mechanic dived into the hatch. Gromov listened. He waited for the sound of the oil priming pump. A buzz. Pressure was up. "Air!" The hiss of compressed air from the tanks hit the cylinders. The V2IS engine, a 12-cylinder diesel beast, sneezed black smoke, shuddered with its entire 50-ton hull, and died. Gromov's heart skipped a beat. If the fuel system was airlocked, this was the end. No time to disassemble the high-pressure fuel pump. "Again! Give it hell!" he yelled, leaning over the side. Second attempt. The starter whined, helping the air. Sneeze. Another sneeze. And suddenly, a low, even, powerful roar. The engine caught. Tongues of flame burst from the exhaust pipes, illuminating the repair pad. The rumble of 520 horsepower drowned out all thoughts. The machine was alive. Gromov climbed into the casemate. Now the most important thing. The gun. He walked up to the breech. Wedge breech block, semi-automatic, a complex mechanism requiring a perfect fit. If it jammed in battle, they were corpses. Gromov grabbed the opening handle. Cold steel. Jerk. The massive wedge, weighing dozens of kilograms, should have gone down softly, like butter. But it went tight. Gromov leaned his shoulder into it, feeling the resistance of the springs and the friction of metal. "Grease!" he barked. The loader held out a can. Gromov scooped up the thick goo with his fingers. He didn't look at what it was. In the light of the dim bulb, the mixture looked black, but he knew that on his hands, blood from skinned fingers had mixed with the spindle oil. He thickly smeared the wedge guides. It was a sacrifice to the god of mechanics. "Again!" Click, clank. The breech slammed shut. Jerk. The breech opened. Softly. Heavy but smooth. Like the bolt of a Mosin rifle magnified 100 times. "It works," Gromov exhaled. He looked at the crew. Their faces, lit by the instrument panel light, were terrifying. Dirty, gaunt, with red eyes. But in those eyes, there was no longer doom. There appeared the vicious confidence of men who found a club in their hands. And not just a club, but the heaviest club on this sector of the front.
Gromov climbed out onto the armor. The sky in the east began to turn gray. Fog rose from the ground, thick as milk. Perfect. Positions, he said quietly, but the crew heard. We have work. The diesel roared, belching a cloud of blue smoke. The ISU 152, clanking its tracks, jerked and slowly crawled away from the graveyard of machines, leaving deep ruts in the damp earth. Team Tula was going hunting. Craftsmanship had been poured into metal. Now the metal had to pass the test of fire. 6 hours ago, it was junk.
Now it was an argument. The tracks of Team Tula ground the greasy Belarusian Chernozem, turning it into black mush. The machine moved heavily, growling with its diesel on the inclines. Gromov chose the position not by the manual, but by hunter's intuition. It was a nameless intersection of two dirt roads, squeezed on both sides by swampy forest, the only solid place for kilometers around. A bottleneck. The Germans, with their heavy Tigers weighing 57 tons, wouldn't crawl into the bog. They would come here, right under the barrel. Morning met them with milk. The fog was not just thick, it was tangible, wet, and cold. Visibility dropped to 20 meters. For an artilleryman, this is a nightmare. You are blind. Your optics, your Hertz panorama, your aiming scales, all this is useless when the world ends beyond the tip of the barrel. But Gromov knew. For an ambush, this is a gift. Fog hides the silhouette. Fog conceals dimensions. 46 tons of steel can be hidden in this white cotton, so that the enemy notices them only when it is too late. "Halt!" Gromov's voice in the headset sounded sharp. "Kill the engine!" The diesel sneezed and fell silent. Silence crashed down on the crew instantly, heavy, ringing. After the roar of the motor and the clatter of tracks, this vacuum of sound pressed on the ears harder than the noise. "Driver, turn left, 2 degrees. Use inertia before we settle dead." The machine rocked slightly. Now the frontal armor looked strictly along the supposed line of fire. The sector of fire was a narrow corridor of the road disappearing into the white mist. "Camouflage, move!" The hatches flew open. The crew poured out onto the armor. Now they were not mechanics, but landscape designers of death. Everything went into action. Spruce branches, chopped bushes, mud. Gromov personally watched to ensure the broken silhouette of the casemate merged with the forest background. Straight lines are the main enemies of camouflage. There are no straight lines in nature. The human eye latches on to geometry, the cut of armor, the straight line of the barrel, the circle of a road wheel. All this had to be broken, blurred. The loader scooped buckets of liquid mud from the rut and poured it over the sides. The gray German paint and green Soviet lacquer disappeared under a layer of earth. "Wrap the muzzle brake," Gromov tossed to the gunner. "It shines, damn it, even without the sun." The barrel was wrapped in burlap, soaked in oil and earth. Now it wasn't a cannon, but a fallen log sticking out of a pile of brushwood. Within 30 minutes, the work was finished. The self-propelled gun disappeared. On the side of the road stood a mound overgrown with bushes. Only an experienced eye could have noticed the unnatural heaviness of this hill, the way it pressed down the soil beneath it. But the Germans wouldn't have time for scrutiny. The crew dived back into the steel belly. Hatches were battened down. Inside, it immediately became stifling. The smell of diesel fuel, sweat, and undried paint stood as a solid wall. In this iron box, they had to live or die. Gromov pressed against the panorama. Nothing. A white veil. The glass fogged up from breath. He wiped it with a finger, but it didn't help. The fog was outside, omnipresent, indifferent. "No landmarks visible, Commander," the gunner said quietly. "How do we hit them? By sound?" "We'll hit them at point blank," Gromov replied. Direct fire distance, 200 meters. In the fog, they'll crawl closer, maybe 100 meters. Time began its strange military countdown. Minutes stretched into hours. An hour in a minute. Waiting is the most exhausting part of war. The adrenaline that drove them all night began to subside, giving way to cold, sticky fear. Not panic, but fear. A rational understanding of what was about to happen. Physiology took its toll.
Hands began to tremble slightly. The mouth went so dry that the tongue seemed like sandpaper. The stomach clenched into a tight knot. They sat silently. Everyone listened to the silence. Drops of condensation fell from the casemate ceiling onto the gun breech. Drip, drip, drip. This sound seemed louder than hammer blows. Gromov looked at his watch. 5 in the morning. They should be here. German punctuality is also part of the tactical and technical characteristics of the enemy. And then the earth trembled. First, it was a vibration felt not by ears, but by the soles of boots. Low frequency, coming through the hull of the self-propelled gun. The trembling of a multi-ton mass crushing the soil. Then came the sound. Distinctive, unmistakable clatter. German tracks sounded different from ours. They had a different track pitch, different metal in the pins. The sound was higher, chirping, overlaid by the low howl of Maybach engine. "They're coming," the loader mouthed. He took the firing mechanism off safety. His fingers went white, gripping the handle. Gromov raised a hand, ordering complete silence. The engine was silent, ventilation off. Any sound from inside could give away their position prematurely. They turned into hearing itself. The sound grew. It rolled in waves out of the fog, filling the entire space. It seemed the forest itself was growling. By the intensity of the drone, Gromov understood. A column was coming. Heavy equipment. No fewer than 10 vehicles. "Armor-piercing," he whispered. "Ready." "Ready," the loader echoed. The breech was closed. 48 kilograms of death already lay in the barrel. A sharp-nosed, armor-piercing tracer shell, 53 BR-540. Muzzle velocity, 600 meters per second. Kinetic energy at the muzzle, 11.5 million joules. This energy was enough to smash the frontal plate of any existing tank at a distance of a kilometer. And here it would be 100 meters. Here physics would move into the category of catastrophe. The fog began to stir. Dark spots emerged in the white mist. They moved, swaying smoothly. The silhouettes were huge, square, angular shapes. These weren't Panzer IVs. These were cats. Into the sight floated a wide, low hull, sloped armor plates, a long barrel with a muzzle brake. Panther, Mark V, 45 tons, frontal armor, 80 millimeters at a 55-degree angle, equivalent to 140 millimeters of vertical armor. A formidable opponent, but only not for the Beast Slayer. Gromov felt his pulse beating in his temples. Thump, thump, thump. The heart pumped blood, demanding oxygen, but he held his breath. The gunner gripped the aiming hand wheels. The crosshairs trembled, looking for a weak spot, but there were no spots in the fog, only a silhouette. "Steady," Gromov whispered, as if calming a rabid dog. "Let him get closer. Let him show his side." The German machine moved cautiously. The commander of the Panther leaned out of the hatch, trying to make out the road. He was only 150 meters away. He was looking right at them, at this strange, dirty hill by the road. The German's gaze slid over the camouflaged barrel. 1 second. 2. The German shouted something into his throat microphone and began to dive back into the turret. The tank turret jerked, starting to turn toward the ambush. Spotted. Time compressed into a dot. No more options. Camouflage blown. Now only caliber speaks. The metal withstood the weight, but would the nerves hold when 75mm slugs started flying in return? And here hell begins. "Fire!" Gromov shouted, and his voice broke into a wheeze. The gunner pressed the firing pedal. The world disappeared in that same second. It wasn't a sound. The human ear is incapable of perceiving an acoustic shock of such force as sound.
It was physical pressure. An instantaneous drop in atmospheric pressure inside the closed steel box that hit the eardrums with the force of a boxing glove. 46 tons of the self-propelled gun's dead weight were thrown into the air. The tracks, dug into the ground, lost traction, and the machine was hurled backward almost half a meter. This was the cruel, brute physics of recoil. The muzzle brake at the end of the barrel took part of the energy of the powder gases, redirecting them to the sides, but the remaining energy would have been enough to flip a truck. Inside the casemate, all loose objects turned into shrapnel. Dust, centuries-old dirt from the floor, scale from the welds, all this billowed up in a dense cloud, instantly clogging lungs. The shell, weighing 48 kilograms, left the barrel channel at a speed of 600 meters per second. The distance to the German tank was less than 150 meters.
For the ballistics of such a caliber, this is not a distance. It is a point-blank shot. The shell needed less than a quarter of a second to cover the space separating them. The crew of the Panther was dead before they heard the shot. Sound simply didn't keep up with death. The Soviet blunt-nosed, armor-piercing shell 53B R540 did not look for weak spots in the German armor. It didn't try to burn through it with a shaped charge jet or split it with a core. It brought with it the kinetic energy of a locomotive compressed into a chunk of steel. The hit struck the joint of the turret and the hull. What happened next defied description in terms of military tactics. It was a catastrophe of resistance of materials. The German cemented steel, brittle and hard, could not withstand the monstrous impulse. Welding seams burst with a screech that was drowned in the roar of the explosion. The turret of the Panther, weighing almost 8 tons, was torn from the ring like a light lid from a boiling pot. It was thrown up and to the side, flipping in the air. The long barrel of the German gun, describing an arc, plugged into the ground, and the turret crashed down next to the mangled chassis. A column of flame, mixed with mechanism parts and fragments of crew bodies, burst from the ripped-open hull of the tank. The detonation of the ammunition load completed the destruction, tearing the sides of the machine from the inside like a cardboard box. The shockwave from the shot of the 152mm gun cleared the fog in front of the self-propelled gun. A perfectly clean corridor of visibility formed, at the end of which smoked a black, shapeless pyre that a second ago was a masterpiece of German engineering. Inside the ISU-152, hell reigned. Gromov was thrown chest first onto the commander's observation device, knocking the wind out of his lungs. The headset didn't save him. A thin, unbearable ringing stood in his ears, blocking out all other sounds. It was a concussion, light but instantaneous. Red circles danced before his eyes. A sharp, sour smell of burnt gunpowder hit his nose, sucked back into the casemate through the opened breach. The fan on the roof of the casemate hummed strainingly, trying to pull out the blue smoke, but its power was not enough. Visibility inside dropped to 0. "Report!" Gromov wheezed, not hearing his own voice. He felt the vibration of his vocal cords, but not the sound. The crew was silent. They were coming to their senses. The loader shook his head, trying to regain hearing. The gunner gripped the handwheels with white fingers, his eyes wide open and staring into the void. It was shock. The first shot of the beast slayer is always a shock, even for those sitting inside.
The sensation is as if you're inside a bell that has been struck by a sledgehammer. Outside, on the road, panic began. The enemy column halted. Rear vehicles began to back up, running into each other. The Germans didn't understand what had happened. In the fog, without a visible flash, their lead tank simply ceased to exist. It was torn to pieces by an unknown force. This didn't look like the work of an anti-tank gun of 45 or even 76mm caliber. Those leave neat holes. Here, the machine was gutted inside out. Fear. Animal, primal fear of an unknown weapon paralyzed the German tankers. They spun their turrets, looking for the enemy, but saw only a wall of fog and the burning carcass of their commander. Gromov was the first to cope with the stunning. He hit the gunner on the shoulder, bringing him to his senses. The gesture was rough, but necessary. "Alive?" The gunner nodded, convulsively gulping air.
"Target destroyed," Gromov shouted, hoping he would be heard through the ringing. "Displace! Driver, back!"
The senior lieutenant understood. Right now, their only defense was chaos. While the Germans were in shock, they had to change position. The shot had unmasked them. The cloud of powder gases and raised dust now hung over their hill like a huge sign. "We are here." The diesel roared, and the self-propelled gun jerked backward, crawling deeper into the bushes. Gromov pressed against the periscope. The sight of the burning panther evoked not joy, but the cold satisfaction of a professional. The calculation proved correct. Physics worked. Mass multiplied by velocity gave an absolute result. But the battle was just beginning. Out of the fog, bypassing the burning wreck, crawled the next shadow. Another panther. And behind it, judging by the rumble, came tigers. Inside the casemate, the temperature jumped 10 degrees at once. The gun breech smoked, radiating heat.
"Load!"
Gromov's command cut through the ringing in ears. Now the race began. Not a race of motors, but a race of muscles. Separate loading. First the shell, then the casing with the charge. 2 strokes. 48 kilograms had to be lifted from the floor, turned around in the cramped casemate, rammed into the breech. Then grabbed the casing weighing 15 kilograms. And all this, in smoke, in heat, with shaking hands. German tanks had unitary cartridges. They fired every 8 seconds. The ISU-152 had a rate of fire of 2 shots per minute. If the crew were gods. If they were dead men wanting to live. Gromov looked at the loader. He was already dragging the next shell, his face twisted from strain, veins on his neck bulging like ropes. War ceased to be shooting. War turned into heavy weightlifting for speed. The prize in which was life. 2 shots per minute. This isn't just a number from a technical manual. It is a rhythm that separated life from death. It is 30 infinite seconds of silence when you are unarmed, and the enemy sees you and turns his turrets. The Achilles heel of the 152mm caliber is separate loading. While the German loader in the Panther simply takes out a unitary cartridge and pushes it into the breech in one motion, spending 5 or 6 seconds on this, the crew of the self-propelled gun performs heavy athletic work in hell. Inside the casemate, the temperature crawled up rapidly. After the first shot and the ejection of the casing, the red-hot metal of the breech began to work like a huge radiator. Outside it was a cool morning, but here, behind the armor, the air heated up to 50 degrees Celsius. There was nothing to breathe.
The fan howled strainingly, but it circulated a mixture of powder fumes, oil vapors, and human sweat in a circle. Eyes stung as if sand had been poured into them. The mucous membrane of the nose dried out and bled. The loader, a stocky Siberian with the neck of a bull, was no longer a human. He was a biological crane. His task, to lift a shell weighing 48 kilograms from the ammo rack. This is the weight of a grown teenager, cast in steel and TNT. Lift it in cramped conditions, on a rocking floor slippery with oil. Turn it without hitting the red-hot breech with the shoulder. Place it on the rammer tray. "Shell!" a hoarse exhale. Metal clanked against the tray. Gromov, dropping the observation instruments, grabbed the rammer, a long wooden pole with a soft tip. Here the commander could not afford to be afraid of getting his hands dirty. In a crew of 5, everyone worked. And 1! Together they leaned into the shell, driving it into the barrel. The driving band of the shell had to bite into the rifling of the barrel with a characteristic ringing click. If not fully seated, the breech wouldn't close. Or worse, a misfire would occur. Click. The shell sat.
"Casing!" Gromov yelled, wiping sweat flooding his eyes. The loader was already reaching for the casing. It was lighter, about 15 kilograms, but inside it was a deadly charge of gunpowder. The brass slipped in hands wet with sweat. One awkward movement, striking the primer against the corner of the breech, and an explosion inside the casemate would smear them over the walls in an even layer of organic matter. The casing went into the chamber. The clank of the wedge breech. This sound was the sweetest sound in the world. It meant the beast slayer was dangerous again. "Ready!" The stopwatch in Gromov's head counted off 28 seconds. Fast. Damn fast for such weight. But for battle, it was an eternity. During this time, 2 German machines managed to turn off the road. They realized that taking this hill head-on was suicide. The Germans were professionals. They began an encirclement, classic pincers. One panther went left, trying to hide in the lowland. The other pushed through the bushes on the right, breaking young trees. They were looking for the side. The side of the ISU was only 90 millimeters of vertical armor, penetrable by any German gun from a kilometer. "Left target," Gromov commanded. "Driver, traverse!" The multi-ton carcass of the self-propelled gun jerked. Tracks churned the earth. Rough aiming with the hull, fine aiming with hand wheels. The gunner spun the handles so fast they merged into a solid circle. He caught the side of the German tank flashing between pine trunks in the crosshairs. "Got him!" Shot. Again the hammer blow to the eardrums. Again the self-propelled gun jumped back, knocking the crew off their feet. The high-explosive fragmentation shell, 53 OF-540, struck just below the turret of the German tank. They were saving armor-piercing, hitting with what was in the barrel. The effect was monstrous. A high-explosive strike of such power does not require penetration. The explosion of 6 kilograms of TNT on the armor created a shockwave that crumpled the side plate inward like foil. The road wheels of the left track flew apart like a fan, tearing the track link. The tank spun in place. The crew inside, even if they survived, was guaranteed to be incapacitated by severe concussion. Blood from ears and noses, rupture of internal organs from pressure difference. The tank froze, turning into a pile of smoking iron. "Reload!" Gromov's scream broke into a screech. Again this hellish cycle. Shell, tray, rammer, casing, breech. Back muscles burned with fire. Hands trembled not from fear, but from overexertion. Every movement was made through, "I can't." Lungs worked like blacksmith's bellows, trying to pull oxygen from the poisoned air.
The second Panther on the right was already coming into firing position. Gromov saw through the periscope how its long barrel with the muzzle brake turned in their direction. The black pupil of death looked straight into the casemate. They were late. Seconds flowed like thick oil. The loader stumbled over a spent casing lying on the floor, nearly dropping the charge. "Come on, son, come on!" Gromov grabbed the casing, practically tearing it from the soldier's hands, and threw it into the breach. The commander's fingers touched the red-hot metal of the breech block. It smelled of burnt skin, but he didn't feel pain. Click of the breech. "Right target! Fire on the move!" The gunner didn't wait for the hull rocking to stop completely. He fired on instinct, on that automatism developed by years of training grounds. The shell left at the same second the German tank spat the flame of a return shot. 2 shells passed each other in the air. The German slug grazed the cheek of the ISU casemate, striking a shower of sparks and leaving a deep furrow in the armor. The impact was such that scale rained down inside, and the glass on the observation device cracked. But the answering argument, weighing 48 kilograms, found its target. Hit on the track and front road wheel. The kinetic energy of the impact tore out the entire front axle of the German tank, along with a chunk of frontal armor. The transmission was flattened. The tank dipped its nose and stood dead, enveloped in smoke. It became quiet in the casemate. Only the wheezing, whistling breathing of men could be heard. They stood leaning their hands on the breech, on walls, on each other. Sweat ran in streams, washing away dirt and leaving light paths on faces black from soot. The tunics could be wrung out. 3, Gromov uttered. He looked at his hands. They were black, covered in abrasions and burns, and trembled so violently that he wouldn't have been able to roll a cigarette right now. This wasn't a war of maneuvers and strategies. It was a war of attrition. Who could lift the weight faster? Who could recover breath faster? Whose iron would withstand the melting temperature? But relaxing was impossible. The rumble on the road didn't subside. The Tigers hadn't said their word yet, and there were fewer and fewer shells in the ammo rack. Gromov knew. The hardest work was still ahead. Their Team Tula was holding for now, but the resource of men and metal melted with every minute. "Load," he said quietly. "They'll be back." Luck in war is a resource as exhaustible as fuel in tanks, and by 6 in the morning, Team Tula's tanks were dry. The fog that served as their shield treacherously dissipated, torn apart by explosions and wind. Now the intersection lay in full view, gray and dirty, cluttered with smoking scrap metal. But the road wasn't empty. From around the bend, crushing the remains of a German armored personnel carrier with its tracks, death itself crawled out. Tiger, Panzerkampfwagen 6, 57 tons of gloomy German genius. Square, angular, looking like a moving fort. Behind it, a second one. Their 88mm guns, famous anti-aircraft guns converted to kill tanks, were already looking toward the Soviet self-propelled gun. Distance, 300 meters. For a Tiger, this is a guaranteed penetration distance. For the ISU-152, it is the distance of a knife fight. Armor-piercing! Gromov's voice was calm, but that calmness cost him gray hairs. The loader, swaying from fatigue, drove the shell into the breach. The casing flew in next. Gromov, with a habitual movement, jerked the closing handle of the wedge breech. The massive steel wedge went up to lock the barrel and stopped. It didn't reach by 1.5 centimeters. Gromov jerked the handle again. Not budging. The breech was jammed. Silence hung in the casemate, more terrible than any roar. It was the silence of the scaffold. It won't go, Gromov exhaled. The reason was clear to him instantly, like a blueprint before his eyes. thermal expansion. Frankenstein malfunctioned. The breech ring was from one machine, the breech wedge from another. In the cold morning air, during assembly, the gaps seemed acceptable. But after a dozen shots, when the metal glowed red-hot, physics took its toll. The steel expanded, and micron tolerances disappeared. Parts not lapped to each other at the factory locked in a death clinch. "Germans!" the gunner yelled. The first shell from the Tiger hit the frontal plate of the casemate. The impact was of such force that the light fixture was torn off. It went dark inside. Only sparks showered from the crew's eyes. The armor held. 90 millimeters of sloped steel deflected the German slug in a ricochet. The shell went screaming into the sky, leaving a deep, smoking cavity on the armor. But the second hit would be more precise. Either they would punch through the mantlet or knock out a track. Panic is a chain reaction. The loader slid down the wall, covering his head with his hands. The gunner froze, staring into the useless sight. They understood. They were trapped, unarmed before two monsters. The machine turned from a hunter into a coffin. But Gromov didn't panic. In his brain, there was no room for emotions. Only the mechanism schematic worked there. If the breech doesn't go by hand, it needs help. An impulse is needed. Kinetic energy exceeding the friction force is needed. "Sledgehammer!" he barked so loud the loader flinched. "Fast!" He didn't pray. He acted. Gromov snatched the heavy blacksmith sledgehammer from the clamps on the casemate wall. In the cramped fighting compartment, swinging was impossible.
Duck!
He stood to his full height, bracing his back against the ceiling. The heat from the breech burned his face. He saw the point of force application, the protruding end of the wedge. He had to hit with jeweled precision, but with animal strength. If you miss, you'll smash the extraction mechanism, and then it's definitely the end. If you hit weakly, you won't move it. Second hit on the armor, this time on the cheek. The welding seam that Gromov himself welded at night cracked. Small shards of scale sprayed inside, cutting the driver's face. The driver screamed. Gromov didn't turn around. He saw only metal. "Come on, move, baby!" Bang! The ring of steel on steel sounded like a gunshot. The sledgehammer bounced off, giving dry pain in the shoulders. The wedge moved a millimeter. Another blow. Gromov hit rhythmically, exhaling with every swing. He was driving the breech block like a nail. It was barbarism.
Any factory engineer would have fainted seeing such treatment of precision mechanics. But here, in smoke and flame, it was the only method of repair. The highest aerobatics of field engineering, brute force applied in the correct vector. The third German shell hit the track. The ISU jerked and settled on its right side. "Track broken!" shouted the driver, wiping blood from his face. "Don't care," Gromov rasped. "We're not going for a drive. We're going to shoot." Last blow. The most powerful. Gromov put all his anger into it, all his hatred for this iron that dared to resist his will. The wedge crunched past the dead point and fell into place. Click. The characteristic metallic sound of the locked barrel channel. The trigger safety unlocked. Contact closed. Gromov tossed the sledgehammer aside. His hands trembled, but it was the trembling of tension, not fear. "Action!" he exhaled. "Gunner, front of the first one! Fire!" There was no time to aim, but the distance was pistol range. Missing a Tiger from 300 meters is impossible, even if you are blind in one eye. The gunner, brought out of his stupor by the commander's voice, pressed the trigger. Shot. This time there was no triumph of physics as with the Panthers. There was just a blow of retribution. The armor-piercing shell hit the Tiger right in the frontal plate, just below the driver's vision slit. The vertical armor of a Tiger is 100 millimeters. The ISU-152 shell penetrates 160 millimeters. Math was on Gromov's side. The shell stitched through the German armor, not noticing resistance. Inside the tank, the ammunition detonated. The heavy turret wasn't torn off, but columns of fire 10 meters high struck from all hatches. The multi-ton machine flared up like a matchbox. The second Tiger began to turn its turret, trying to finish off the wounded beast. He saw the Russian self-propelled gun was immobilized. He knew they had a long reload time. The German ace crew acted competently. They aimed for the gun mantlet to guarantee disabling the cannon, but Gromov outplayed them again, not with tactics, but with mechanics. The breach, worked in by the sledgehammer, opened easily. The extractor threw out the smoking casing. "High explosive!" Gromov yelled. "No armor-piercing left! Give me HE!" It was a risk. The high-explosive shell 53OF-540 is intended for destroying pillboxes and infantry. Against the frontal armor of a Tiger, it could prove useless. But there was no choice. The loader, growling from strain, threw the shell onto the tray. "Faster! Faster, sons of bitches, or we burn!" The Germans fired first. The shell hit the gun mantlet on the very edge. A monstrous blow shook the machine. The barrel rang like a tuning fork. Inside the casemate, something snapped. Glass from instruments showered down. The gunner fell, hitting his head on the sight.
Gromov jumped into his place.
He didn't see the target. The optics were smashed. He saw only a blurred spot through the open direct fire hatch. "Loaded!" the loaders scream. Gromov, without looking, pulled the trigger. It was a shot at point-blank range, direct fire. The high-explosive shell weighing 43.5 kilograms hit the Tiger under the turret at the junction with the hull. The fuse was set for high-explosive action. An explosion of such force doesn't penetrate armor. It breaks it. The welding seams of the German hull came apart along the entire length. The turret was skewed and jammed tight. Inside the tank, from the monstrous concussion, the engine was torn from its mounts. Accumulator batteries burst, flooding everything with acid. The crew didn't die from shrapnel. They died from barotrauma. The shockwave that passed through the armor turned their insides into jelly. The tank stopped, shrouded in a black cloud, but didn't burn. It simply died.
Stood whole on the outside, but dead on the inside.
Gromov slid from the gunner's seat onto the dirty floor. His chest heaved, grabbing red-hot air. Nearby lay the saving sledgehammer, a blunt instrument that turned out to be more reliable than any precision mechanics. He looked at his hands. Knuckles were skinned to meat, nails black. These were the hands not of an officer, but of a worker who had just finished a hard shift. "Alive," he whispered. Mechanics didn't fail. Ahead was more battle. But they had passed this crisis. Passed thanks to the fact that a Russian master knows, if the mechanism doesn't work, just apply more force. "Armor piercing! 0!" The loader's scream sounded like a judge's sentence. "Only HE left! 20 fragmentation rounds!" Gromov tore himself away from the observation device for a second. Inside the casemate stood a blue fog. Ventilation wasn't coping. Powder fumes ate eyes, clogged the throat. 0 armor piercing. This meant they had taken away the scalpel and left only the sledgehammer. An armor-piercing shell is a surgeon's tool. It strikes precisely at a vulnerable spot, stitches through steel, kills mechanisms. The high-explosive fragmentation shell, 53OF540, is a butcher's tool.
It is 43.5 kilograms of steel and almost 6 kilograms of cast TNT. "He in the tube," Gromov commanded. His voice was dry, creaky like an ungreased hinge. "We'll break their bones." The situation at the intersection was changing. The Germans, having lost the lead-heavy tanks, regrouped. Now they acted more cautiously, but viciously. From behind the smokescreen emerged medium tanks, fours of the latest modification, with long-barreled guns, and Stug self-propelled guns. They moved under infantry cover. Gray figures of grenadiers ran from crater to crater, preparing to strike with Panzerfausts. "Target, self-propelled gun!"
Distance 400.
The loader, wheezing, lifted the heavy HE shell. His hands slipped. The weight of 43 kilograms at the end of a battle seems like the weight of a tombstone. He nearly dropped it on the breach.
Careful!
Gromov barked, catching the shell from below.
Fuse to high explosive. Don't unscrew the cap.
If you leave the cap, the fuse works with a delay. The shell has time to slightly deepen into the obstacle. If you unscrew it, it works instantly, from touching a branch. Now they needed impact action. The breech clanked. The gunner caught the low silhouette of the German assault gun in the crosshairs.
Fire!
The ISU-152 shuddered. This shot felt different. An armor-piercing leaves sharply with a whistle. A high explosive leaves with a heavy, guttural roar, as if the underworld itself flies out of the barrel. The shell described an arc and hit the frontal plate of the German Stug's casemate. There was no penetration. A high-explosive shell isn't intended to punch through 80 millimeters of steel. But you can't cheat physics. The energy of the explosion of 6 kilograms of TNT equivalent, multiplied by the kinetic energy of the impact of a slug weighing half a centner, created an earthquake effect on the scale of one vehicle. The explosion was blinding. A ball of fire hid the German self-propelled gun for a moment. When the smoke cleared, the Stug stood in place. Externally almost intact, only the gun mantlet was twisted to the side, and the front road wheels were pressed into the ground. But it was dead. A shockwave of such force passed through the armor like current through wires. Inside the German casemate, internal layers of metal spalled off. Fragment dust, so-called secondary fragments, turned the crew into mince. The welding seams of the hull burst along the entire length. The roof of the casemate buckled into a hump. The transmission was ground into crumbs simply from the vibrational impact. The machine remained standing as an iron coffin in which nothing biological survived.
Hit!
Shouted the gunner.
He stopped! Infantry, left, along the ditch!
Gromov noticed movement. A dozen German soldiers with a machine gun were breaking through to their flank. If they got within 30 meters, they would burn them. The ISU is blind in close combat.
Load! Fragmentation! Remove cap!
Now instantaneous action was needed. Another cycle of hell. The loader's back was black with sweat. He moved on pure automatism like a zombie. Lift, ram, casing, close.
On the infantry! Landmark! Dry birch! Fire!
The shell hit the parapet of the ditch, 2 meters from the group of Germans. The explosion of a 152mm high-explosive fragmentation shell is not the pop of a grenade. It is a local apocalypse. A crater formed in the earth in which a passenger car could be hidden. The shock wave swept people away like crumbs from a table. Those in the epicenter were simply atomized. Those within a radius of 20 meters were killed by the pressure drop. The air instantly compressed to the density of concrete and then expanded, rupturing lungs and eardrums. German soldiers were thrown 10 meters, bones broken, Fragments of the heavy shell casing, jagged pieces of hot steel weighing a kilogram each, mowed down the bushes like a giant scythe. Where people ran a second ago, only smoking black earth and silence remained. "That's a broom," whispered the driver, looking into the periscope. But it was too early to rejoice. In response, shells drummed on the armor. Boom, boom, ping! German tanks, not seeing the camouflaged self-propelled gun, fired at the area, orienting on the flashes. One 75mm caliber shell hit the side in the area of the engine compartment. The armor held, but inside the casemate, the impact tore off a fire extinguisher, which fell with a crash onto the gunner's legs. "Hold on!" Gromov yelled. "As long as the armor rings, we're alive!" Another hit, right in the forehead. Ricochet. But from the terrible vibration inside the machine, scale rained down. Fine, sharp metal crumbs dug into faces, into hands. Blood flowed down Gromov's cheek, mixing with fuel oil. But he didn't feel pain. He felt only the rage of the machine. The ISU-152 groaned. Metal creaked, taking blows. Welding seams applied at night by trembling hands experienced loads at the yield point. But Team Tula stood. Soviet viscous armor absorbed the energy of German shells. "Another one climbing, right!" It was a 4. It jumped out arrogantly, trying to slip through the fire-swept sector. "Fire!" Gromov didn't even adjust. At such a distance it was impossible to miss. The HE shell hit the tank under the track. The explosion flipped the 25-ton machine. The tank was tossed like a toy. Its bottom, the weakest spot, turned out to be torn to shreds. The turret was ripped from the ring and thrown into the bushes. Road wheels flew in different directions. One of them, smoking, rolled down the road like a wheel of fate. Inside the self-propelled gun, it became unbearably hot. The thermometer had long passed 60. Men worked at the limit of human capabilities. The heart beat somewhere in the throat. Every breath was a fight. But no one stopped. War, here and now, turned into a simple formula: mass of explosives versus thickness of steel. And 152 millimeters were an undeniable argument.
"Another shell," Gromov wheezed. "While there's powder, we are the authority here."
The loader fell to his knees in front of the ammo rack, trying to pull out the next shell. He had no strength left to stand up. He pushed the 40-kilogram pig with his shoulder, growling from impotence and anger. Gromov rushed to him. Together, with a jerk, on tendons, they lifted Death and drove it into the barrel. "You won't take us!" the senior lieutenant screamed, slamming the breech. The machine barked fire again, sending another package of destruction toward the enemy. Each press of the trigger was a hammer blow on the anvil of war, forging victory out of mud, blood, and red-hot iron. The breech clanked with a dry, nasty sound that in battle is scarier than an explosion. Empty. The ammo rack, which an hour ago seemed infinite, showed its bottom. The loader fumbled with his hands on the floor, in corners, looked under seats, but fingers found only spent casings and oily rags. "Empty, Commander!" The soldier's voice sounded not with panic, but devastation. "Ammo 0! No armor piercing, no fragmentation, not even smoke!" 152 millimeters of steel became a useless pipe. 46 tons of complex engineering turned into an unarmed tractor. But the war wasn't over. From the gray veil of burning, right down the center of the road, roaring with an overheated engine, the last German tank burst out. It was a 4 with a long barrel, a late modification hung with side skirts. He was going all in. His crew realized the Russian self-propelled gun had fallen silent. They saw the monstrous barrel no longer spewing flame. Distance, 50 meters. The German gunner was already turning the hand wheels, bringing the barrel onto the casemate. From such a distance, they wouldn't miss. They would simply shoot the stationary target at point-blank range, methodically driving shell after shell into the same spot until they punched through the armor or set the tanks on fire. Gromov saw the black pupil of the German cannon. Time slowed to the viscosity of tar. Run? Open hatches and jump out under machine guns? That's death. Surrender? Impossible. A single solution flashed in his brain. If there is no gunpowder, mass becomes the weapon. The kinetic energy of 46 tons, accelerated to a speed of 30 kilometers per hour, equals the impact of a train.
Driver, gas!
Gromov yelled, tearing his voice.
Ram, hit the bastard!
The driver mechanic didn't ask questions. His foot pressed the fuel pedal to the floor, to the stop, to the crunch of metal. The V2IS engine howled. 12 cylinders, exhausted by hours of combat, gave everything they had left. RPMs jumped to the red line. The ISU-152 jumped forward. It didn't gain speed smoothly. It jerked from the spot, throwing clumps of earth from under the tracks. It was the charge of an enraged rhinoceros. The German tank fired. The shell hit the upper edge of the casemate, ricocheted, tearing out a piece of armor the size of a fist, and went into the sky. They didn't have time for a second shot. Reloading required 5 seconds.
Gromov didn't have those seconds. The distance closed instantly. 40 meters. 30. 10. Gromov braced his hands and feet against the casemate walls.
Hold on!
Impact. It wasn't a sound. It was the crunch of the machine's bones breaking. The nose of the self-propelled gun, higher and heavier, slammed into the forehead of the German tank, crushing it like a tin can. The inertia of the Soviet machine was monstrous. The ISU crushed the front of the 4 under itself. A screech of tearing metal rang out, tracks snapping and drive sprocket teeth flying. The German tank was thrown back and spun around. Its running gear was destroyed. Road wheels were torn out with flesh. The left side of the hull turned out to be pressed inward, blocking the driver's hatch. The machines froze in a deadly clinch. Locked by twisted iron, shrouded in steam from punctured radiators. Silence lasted exactly 1 second. The cannon was silent, but the battle continued.
Gromov understood. The German crew was alive. Now they would open the hatches. They had submachine guns, grenades. They would burn the self-propelled gun from the outside. Rage, cold and calculating, flooded his consciousness. When shells run out, teeth come into play. Gromov tore his PPSH from the wall. Shpagin submachine gun. Drum magazine with 71 rounds. Heavy, reliable, primitive tool of close combat.
Hatches open,
he commanded.
Fight!
He hit the commander's hatchlock with his shoulder. The heavy lid flipped back with a crash. Fresh air mixed with the smell of burnt rubber hit his face. Gromov leaned out to the waist. On the armor of the German tank, just 2 meters from him, the turret hatch was opening. A head in a black side cap appeared. A German officer. He also held a Walther in his hands. Eyes to eyes. A moment in which it was decided whose reaction was faster. Whose finger was a millimeter shorter. Gromov pulled the trigger earlier.
The PPSH in his hands shook in a frantic rhythm.
Rate of fire, 1,000 rounds per minute. This isn't shooting. It's a stream of lead. The burst cut down the German, throwing him back into the hatch. From the side hatch of the turret, the loader tried to climb out. Gromov shifted the barrel. A long burst stitched through the gray uniform. Casings rained down on the armor of the self-propelled gun like golden rain, ringing like coins.
The magazine emptied with frightening speed. The bolt of the submachine gun flashed before his eyes as a blurred spot.
Take that! For Tula! For the boys!
Gromov didn't shout. He growled through clenched teeth. This wasn't a battle of machinery. It was a brawl in a back alley. Brutal, dirty, devoid of any nobility. There were no tactics here, only the physiology of survival. The loader of the self-propelled gun, leaning out of his hatch, threw an F1 grenade into the open hatch of the German turret.
Get down! Gromov dived down, slamming the hatch. A dull thump of an explosion shook the German tank from the inside. Thick black smoke poured through the vision slits. Inside the ISU, silence fell. This time, final. Gromov slid to the bottom of the fighting compartment, pressing the hot submachine gun to his chest. Smoke rose from the PPSH barrel. His hands shook so much he couldn't unclench his fingers on the stock. His heart pounded somewhere in his throat, trying to break his ribs. The adrenaline that held him for 6 hours straight began to retreat, leaving behind leaden heaviness. "Done," the driver rasped. They sat in the semi-darkness, dirty, deafened, exhausted to the limit. Around them, metal cooled. The machine, assembled from 2 corpses, had fulfilled its task. It didn't just stop the enemy. It ground him up, devoured him, and spat him out. Gromov looked at his hands. They were black from soot, bloody from abrasions, but they were alive. He felt a vein pulsing on his wrist. He took a crumpled pack of cigarettes from his pocket. Matches were broken. "Give me a light," he asked the gunner. The lighter flame illuminated the crew's faces. These were the faces of old men, although the oldest of them was not even 30. That morning they lived a whole life, a life measured in calibers, millimeters of armor, and seconds of reloading. Outside, through the armor, only the crackle of the burning German tank and the distant singing of birds could be heard, a strange, surreal contrast. Nature was reclaiming this intersection, but the intersection now belonged to them, by right of the strong, by right of those who turned out harder than iron. Silence returned to the intersection not immediately. First, it broke through the ringing in ears, thin and annoying, like a mosquito squeak. Then sounds of the cooling world began to emerge. The crackle of burning wood, the hiss of leaking fluids, dull pops of cartridges exploding in the fire inside German ammo racks. The wind, lazy and indifferent, began to tear the veil of smoke, revealing the panorama of what remained of the Wehrmacht's elite tank group. It was no longer a crossroads. It was a museum of destroyed engineering, an open-air morgue where metal lay in bizarre, unnatural poses. The fog, treacherously hiding the enemy in the morning, now finally dissipated, exposing the results of the work of caliber 152 millimeters. On a stretch of road 300 meters long, smoked 6 heavy vehicles. 6 steel fortresses, each costing millions of Reichsmarks and thousands of man-hours of highly skilled labor, turned into piles of useless scrap. The first, Panther, the one that took the hit in the turret, lay overturned, looking like a dissected beetle. Its underside, usually hidden from eyes, now looked at the sky, demonstrating the complex suspension system. Nearby, half sunk into the swampy soil, blackened the skeleton of a tiger. Its frontal armor, considered impenetrable, had a neat hole melted at the edges, the trace of an armor-piercing shell. From inside the hull stretched greasy black smoke. Rubber tires of road wheels and fuel remnants were burning. A little further, burying its barrel in the ground, froze the German self-propelled gun. Its casemate was opened like a tin can by the explosion of a high-explosive shell. The metal of the roof was bent outward like petals of a monstrous flower. Here, the physics of explosion demonstrated its absolute power over material. Steel sheets thick as a finger were torn like paper. But the most terrible monument of this battle was the coupling in the center. The ISU-152 and the German tank fused in the final ram.
The Soviet machine stood heavily listed to the right side. Its right track was torn, track links scattered like a fan in the mud. The frontal part was covered with deep furrows from ricochets. The paint burned off completely, exposing gray, rough metal. Team Tula, assembled in one night from 2 corpses, looked terrible. It looked like a boxer after the 12th round, beaten, bloody, but standing on his feet over the body of a knocked-out opponent. Under its massive nose lay the remains of the German 4. The tank was literally pressed into the ground. Its turret was twisted to the side, the barrel bent at a right angle. The multi-ton carcass of the self-propelled gun crushed the enemy under itself, breaking the spine of his transmission. It was a static picture of the absolute dominance of mass and rage. Gromov opened the hatch fully with difficulty. Hinges creaked, clogged with sand and soot. He climbed onto the roof of the casemate and sat, legs dangling. Air. The first breath of clean air seemed sweet as water. Lungs, clogged with powder gases, greedily absorbed oxygen. But the heavy, nauseating spirit of burnt meat and red-hot iron mixed with the smell of the morning forest. It was the smell of victory. Not bookish, but real, dirty, heavy, and stinking. From the forest, from the direction of Soviet positions, a growing rumble was heard. It wasn't that alarming low roar of Maybachs that made blood run cold. It was the ringing, high, almost cheerful sound of V2 diesels. Ours. 3 T-34s jumped out onto the road. They moved fast, turrets turned, ready for battle. The tankers expected to see a German breakthrough, expected to meet a steel fist punching through the defense. But they saw a graveyard. The lead T-34 braked sharply, skidding through the mud. The others stopped behind it. The hatch of the command vehicle opened. A young lieutenant in a clean headset leaned out to the waist and froze. He looked at the panorama of the slaughter with wide-open eyes. His gaze slid over torn German tanks, over craters in which a hut could be hidden, over uprooted trees. And, finally, his gaze stopped on the ISU-152. Against the background of elegant, swift T-34s, the self-propelled gun looked like a prehistoric monster. Huge, angular, black from soot. Oil dripped from punctured pipes, mixing with mud. Heat haze rose from the overheated barrel, distorting the air. It seemed the machine was breathing. The lieutenant shifted his gaze to the man sitting on the armor. Gromov was black. Face, hands, tunic, everything was covered with an even layer of fuel oil and soot. Only teeth and whites of eyes, inflamed with burst vessels, showed white. He sat motionless, hands dropped, in which the fine, nasty tremor of overexertion still trembled. The tankers from the T-34s began to climb out of their machines. They walked toward the self-propelled gun, slowly, warily, as if afraid this beast might come alive and rush at them. They walked past burning Tigers, past mangled Panthers, and on their faces read not just respect. It was awe. They, tankers of medium tanks, knew the price of meeting a Tiger. For them, a Tiger was a death sentence. They knew their 85mm took it only from close range and only in the side. And here, on this patch, lay a whole company of heavy vehicles, destroyed by a single self-propelled gun. One of the tankers, an elderly mechanic, walked up to the torn track of the ISU. He ran his hand over the melted edge of the armor plate where a German shell ricocheted. The metal was still hot. "What a hide you have, Mother," he said quietly, addressing the machine like a living being. "How much you took." Gromov didn't react. He looked somewhere through people, through the forest. Commands still sounded in his head. "Load! Fire! Recoil!"
The mechanism of battle continued to spin by inertia, grinding the remnants of nerves. The lieutenant walked up to the self-propelled gun. He looked up at Gromov. He wanted to say something, ask how they survived, how they managed to stop this avalanche. But words stuck in his throat. Any words now seemed small and unnecessary against the background of this monumental picture of destruction. The lieutenant simply put his hand to his headset, saluting. Not by regulation, not standing at attention, but simply as a sign of recognition of supreme mastery. The crew of the self-propelled gun began to climb out. The loader literally fell out of the hatch, falling to his knees in the grass. He was vomiting bile. Poisoning by powder gases was taking its toll. The gunner sat on the edge of the hatch, greedily gulping air and wiping his face with a rag that only made him dirtier. The driver lay on the armor, arms spread, looking at the sky. They looked not like heroes from a poster, but like miners who miraculously escaped a cave-in. Dirty, emaciated, deafened, but alive. Silence at the intersection became complete. Even the fires began to subside, finishing off what could burn. Only the metal of the ISU-152 made sounds. Loud, ringing clicks. This was the armor and barrel cooling. The machine was talking, complaining about the pain it had to endure. Gromov took the last, miraculously surviving cigarette from his pocket. It was flattened, tobacco spilled out, but he straightened it with black, unbending fingers. The lieutenant from the ground held out a lighter. Gromov took a drag. Smoke hit his lungs, causing a coughing fit. He spat black saliva onto the armor. "Maintenance needed," he said hoarsely, and his voice sounded like grinding stones. "Oil lines punctured. Track needs changing. And the breach jams, damn it. Needs stripping down." The lieutenant blinked.
He expected to hear anything. A story about the battle, curses at the Germans, joy of victory. But he heard a mechanic's report. That was the essence. For Gromov, what happened wasn't a feat, it was work. Heavy, deadly dangerous, emergency work to eliminate a breakthrough. He didn't feel like the savior of the front. He felt like a master whose tool worked at the limit, but didn't break. And this look, the look of a professional at a pile of burning iron, was scarier and more majestic than any pathos. The war here was over. Only logistics and repair remained. By noon, a Willys broke through to the intersection. The nimble American Jeep bounced over potholes, driving around craters like a frightened hare. The battalion commander got out of the car. The major was in a clean, not yet sweaty tunic, with a map case over his shoulder. He stopped 10 steps from the self-propelled gun and took off his cap. His gaze slowly moved from the smoking skeletons of Tigers to the black, scarred carcass of the ISU-152. The major was an experienced officer. He had seen a lot. Burning crossings, frontal infantry attacks, the meat grinder of urban battles. But such a graveyard of elite German equipment, arranged by one crew, he saw for the first time. It didn't fit into staff standards. By all calculations, a battery of anti-tank guns should have stood here, and all of them should have died to delay such an armada. But here stood one machine, and it was alive. Gromov came down from the armor.
He walked toward the battalion commander with the heavy, shuffling gait of a man who worked 3 shifts at a blast furnace without a break. He didn't try to march or adjust his uniform. His overalls turned into rags soaked in blood and oil. On his face, only eyes shone. He stopped and tried to bring his hand to his headset, but the hand was so heavy that the gesture came out blurred.
Comrade Major, Senior Lieutenant Gromov. Task accomplished. Breakthrough eliminated. The Major looked at him as if a ghost stood before him. Gromov, he uttered quietly. Do you even realize what you've done, Gromov? Army headquarters already buried this sector. We thought they'd reach the rear in an hour. And you just ground them up. The battalion commander took out a notepad. His hands trembled slightly. Write a list, Lieutenant. Everyone for the Hero Star. The mechanic, gunner, loader. Drill a hole in your tunic, too. This is a feat, Gromov. A real, honest-to-God feat. Gromov was silent. He looked at his boots, covered in a layer of greasy Belarusian mud. The word feat seemed alien, inappropriate to him now. It was from newspaper editorials, from political officers' speeches, from beautiful posters. Here, at the intersection, there was no feat. There was work. Dirty, heavy, deadly dangerous work. There was the physics of impact. There was strength of materials. There was thermodynamics. He wiped his hands with an oily rag, leaving new black streaks on it. Comrade Major. Gromov's voice was dull, devoid of any pathos. Medals, that's later. My machine is wrecked. Recoil hydraulics need changing. Fluid boiled, seals blown. Recuperator empty. The breech jams every other time. The wedge is deformed from overheating. The right track is holding on by a thread. Pins are smashed. He spoke about the machine as a surgeon speaks about a critical patient after an operation. Not about how heroically the operation went, but about stitches possibly splitting and the pulse being thready. The Major was taken aback. He expected joy, expected emotions, expected the lieutenant to ask for alcohol or a smoke. But the lieutenant reported on seals. What are you talking about, Gromov? The battalion commander asked again. You burned 6 heavy tanks. Do you understand you wrote history today? History is written by writers, Comrade Major. Gromov raised his eyes. In them was the ageless fatigue of a master. We just turn bolts. If I don't strip the recuperator now, the gun will tear off the mount on the next shot. I need spare parts. Repair kit number 1, spindle oil, 2 spare track links, and a capable welder, if there is one. My seam on the casemate cracked. Needs rewelding. In this was the whole essence. Gromov didn't feel like a hero of an ancient tragedy. He was a professional, a master of the workshop of war. His self-propelled gun was not a war chariot, and not an altar of victory. It was a machine tool. Complex, powerful, temperamental instrument of 152 millimeter caliber. And this instrument required care. For Gromov, the destroyed Tigers were not defeated dragons, but defects in the adversary's work. German engineers created bad machines, too complex, too heavy. And he, Gromov, together with Tula workers, created a machine that turned out better. He proved the theorem of superiority of the Soviet School of Design, proved not on paper, but with an armor-piercing argument. You'll get the repair kit, the Major said quietly, hiding the notepad, and a welder, and alcohol. Everything will be there, Gromov. He stepped forward and hugged the dirty, stinking officer tightly, man to man. The Major wasn't afraid to soil his parade tunic.
Now this dirt was more precious than any orders.
"Thank you, master,"
he whispered. Gromov turned and walked back to the machine. The crew was already asleep. The driver dozed right on the armor, putting his headset under his head. The loader sat by the track, staring pointlessly at one spot. Gromov walked up to them. Didn't kick them. Let them sleep. They earned it. He climbed into the toolbox himself, took out a 32mm wrench, had to tighten the idler wheel mounting bolts. The vibration was terrible. They could have loosened. He lay on his back, right in the liquid mud, under the bottom of the multi-ton machine. It was dark there and smelled of diesel. That was his place. He felt for the nut, leaned on the wrench. Muscles seemed about to tear from pain, but he pulled. The war wasn't over. Tomorrow would be a new battle, and the machine had to be ready. Victory in that war was forged by exactly such people. Not those who spoke beautifully from podiums, but those who knew how to read blueprints and weld steel under fire. Those who treated war as heavy labor that must be performed with quality, on time, and in compliance with technical conditions. The skill of the armorer, engineering ingenuity, and calloused hands that won't waver. Gromov lay under his beast slayer, and the rhythmic clatter of the wrench on metal sounded in the silence of the coming day. It wasn't a salute. It was the sound of repair. The sound of life, which, despite everything, continued. 152 millimeters of arguments were ready for a new dialogue, and the master knew his business. This story is not about a miracle. Miracles don't happen in war. There is accuracy of aiming, speed of reloading, and strength of armor steel. And there is a man standing at the levers. A man who does not consider himself a hero, because heroism for him is simply meeting the production quota in extreme conditions. Remember them, not as bronze monuments, but as living people who smelled of sweat and fuel oil. People who, with their own hands, nut by nut, assembled our victory and welded it to death forever.